Our job is to dive in and study South Carolina government, and that's what we've been doing for the past decade, digging into the web of complex laws and the structure of government and the dangers in a handful of politicians controlling the state and, frankly, putting money in their pockets. I don't say that lightly. That is my research-driven conclusion, and we've proved it. So the most powerful politicians in the state of South Carolina, many of them are directly profiting from the control they exert. So what have we come to understand? Boeing was a real red flag, and it was the first time my organization ever spoke up and said, hang on a minute. They announced the Boeing plan in a rushed session, a special session, in which legislators flipped an amendment, did all kinds of crazy procedural stuff, and announced that they were basically giving Boeing $1 billion in incentives, and everyone was celebrating. They boasted all these jobs. The hype was at an all-time high, and all we said, very quietly and meekly, I might add, was, so how do you know how many jobs? And are they going to South Carolinians? And how much money is this actually going to cost us? And how do you know that? The leadership was livid. The meltdown was huge. The push was nothing like I've ever seen. The anger level that we had challenged them just to that level. And the more we researched and studied, here's what emerged. Economic analysis. They said that they did such a thing, but you know what? They didn't. They didn't. When our investigative website, which is called thenerve.org, I encourage you to check it out, started digging into what actually happened. What do you guys actually know when you voted for $1 billion incentive package, which included, I might add, some cash up front, capital, and ultimately started including bond debt. Bond debt on the backs of taxpayers. And that is one of the most dangerous consequences of these studies. In the hands of politicians, they are far from innocuous. And what they have been justifying over the years has led us to a place where we're putting taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars in debt to finance really revenue for big corporations. So it's not the opportunity cost alone, but it's the cash up front, it's the increased taxes, it's the smaller independent businesses, and it's the debt. And that is all on taxpayers. Here are some of the little tidbits about how these studies really work. So we asked 12 senators, 6 on one side, 6 on another, tell us about that economic analysis that the leadership says they gave you, because we couldn't get a copy of it. Nobody had a copy of that economic development analysis that justified a massive taxpayer payoff, really. So I just said, what's in it? All 12 said, we never saw one. There was no economic analysis. But as one senator put it, I'm not making this up. You're going to think I'm exaggerating, and that's fair enough. But I'm not. Said he really didn't need an economic analysis. He'd gone ahead and figured up some conclusions on the back of a napkin. And the way he saw it, I mean, they're going to have this many here, and these, you got to have engineers, you got people making sandwiches, you got to have, and he literally talked himself through the economic impact and the job creation on the back of a napkin, and went on ahead and voted for $1 billion tax incentive package. That guy probably put more thought into it than most of them. So you see the reality of what they know when they pass these laws, when they give away all your money. We have started to ask to see that stuff. And I think that's been a good bit of the meltdown, because we're pushing to see the math, show us the math. Now Boeing's a pretty big corporation, so that may seem on the surface to be, let's just put it delicately, arguably less risky than, say, the call center. but there is no difference in how they treat those. If you come to South Carolina, sit down, have a good lobbyist, and make a case, you're going to get this deal. They're giving all of these companies, you think there's market research, you think there might be some economic impact analysis, you think that people are asking about projected, I don't know, possible labor disputes, the basic due diligence that anyone would do before obligating hundreds of millions of dollars. Basic due diligence. None of that. Do we have any evidence of, ever, in any of these deals? None. Not just faulty, but none. Is there a use of these studies? I would say what's good about these studies, look, done by responsible people, like these guys, yes, there is some value. Historical trends, right? Some limited projection if everything stays the same. Here's a good overview of what's likely to happen, but it's based on what happened when. Responsible economists understand that you cannot predict human behavior, that a multiplier effect cannot be determined in a math model. Company A may well inspire the creation of other jobs, but what if Company B gets all of its supplies online, shipped in, and there are no South Carolina suppliers necessary? You're not going to factor any of that in. That makes sense, right? But you can't tell these people that because they're busy justifying their behavior. I will give you a concrete and real example, and it's something we exposed. The Board of Economic Advisors is the state of South Carolina's economist division. It's their job to do forecasting. When former Governor Haley, current Ambassador Haley, announced in January of 2015 that she was proposing her plan to raise gas taxes. We would raise the tax, but it's gonna result in income tax cuts. The gas tax goes up over 3 years, but we're gonna cut your income tax by 2% over 10 years. Now, we didn't need an econometric model for people to say, no, don't like that. It's called a tax swap. Revenue neutrality, by the way, is another reason we have these studies. To prove, not even just that it's a good thing, but that a tax hike is revenue neutral. So what's wrong with that picture? Who cares if it's revenue neutral to the state? It's never cost neutral to you. But these studies are done as this one was. So let me tell you, when the governor said it'll all even out, and basically it's an even swap, the numbers that went into, and I literally had to go get a magnifying glass. Not exaggerating. I had to go to my kitchen, open the drawer, and pull out the magnifying glass to get to the small print. Here is what they were justifying a tax hike. For this to work, this tax swap, income levels of South Carolinians would have to grow by 4.3% every year for 10 years. Now, I say this because this was the governor's plan. That was the study was done by the state Board of Economic Advisors. 4.3% rise in your income levels every year for 10 years. Now, we took a look at this. How much do you think income level, how much do you think they really did rise over the previous years? How about less than 1%? At least over 4 years straight. I can tell you, South Carolina, pretty confidently, that our income levels have never grown by 4.3%. Maybe not at all, not in decades, and certainly not years in a row. But that was the projection. Now understand, that is the basis on which they were arguing this was an even tax swipe, and it wouldn't cost you anything. The second figure they put forward was that we would have 210,000 new state income tax filers. 210,000 new residents paying income taxes. Well, that's the number they needed to make this work. So the population growth of something like 1% is what the entire population grew over the same 4 or 5 year period. It's never happened that way. This is the difference between what's valuable to analyze and what they actually do. Because that is what they actually do in those studies. And what I've presented to you, not only a real life example, but probably at the very least, the most honest. They at least somewhere showed you, well, now they talk about that. And nobody else read it. We did, because that's what we do. So you see, if the governor is going to present that and the Board of Economic Advisors is confident in it, what do you think happens down at the local level? What assumptions do you think go into these numbers? The two things they always promise us: job creation, jobs, and higher income levels. I have no idea how they can even gauge how many jobs are actually created in the county. I don't know how they could even determine that. Not honestly, anyway, and especially not considering the assumptions that went into that. Of course they tried, but I think it's interesting they're starting to feel like they have to do that. Because of these studies and all these promises, you know what you don't hear? Bankrupt. All the companies that fail and the cost to you. They don't tell you that. We pushed so hard on some of these studies and numbers that they started to say jobs announced instead of jobs created. 400 jobs announced. Politician X has announced more than 50,000 new jobs in South Carolina. No, but really, that's your takeaway. So here's the other thing I'll tell you. They have no idea how many jobs have been created in the state of South Carolina. They don't track the data. We asked. We went to 3 state agencies that should have tracked the number of jobs created by the Boeing deal. And again, I throw that one out there because it was the biggest and the most public. And the one where there should have been some better results. We asked the Department of Commerce. Yeah, they don't really know. The Department of Employment and Workforce, they didn't have that data. Department of Revenue, where the supposed authority is supposed to exist for them to pull back, claw back. If the deal goes south, we're supposed to get our money back. Department of Revenue has never done that, as best we can tell. So we asked them for the data. One of those 3 agencies told us to call Boeing. So here's the thing. One of 2 things is true. Either they do not track it, or they will not tell you. One of those 2 things is true. So this is the flawed, it's gotten so bad that they don't even feel they have to justify it anymore. They're just not reporting the numbers. And that's what this leads to, the dangers. Major decisions are being made based on these studies. Huge policy decisions like raising the gas tax. A study quoted liberally by members of the General Assembly as a reason this is good for your pocketbook was that the tax would be paid, at least a third of it, by out-of-state motorists. They threw that number out, and I don't mean just casually, on the floor as a reason to do it. We dug into where that came from. A task force report. Guess who was on the task force? The Concrete Association, Truckers Association, the Engineers Association, the Save Our Roads Alliance, that was comprised of the chamber folks, and a few local government people. No, really. And I said to a reporter, that number is fabricated, yeah. You go back to the DOT and ask them to prove it. Called me back later and said, yeah, they pretty much conceded they couldn't really back up that number either. It came from this task force report. The task force had no citation for this number. I know for a fact, now this is anecdotal, but I had legislators tell me they were scrambling to send someone over to figure this out and get them a number. It wasn't true. Worse yet, we don't know where it came from. But y'all, it's not just beyond simply PR. I think the tail's wagging the dog on these things now. I know that legislators are asking for these studies, and they're pushing groups and economists to do these studies to justify what they want to do. And there's where we are. And I will say as a close, and I'd love to take questions later, the consequences of this lead not only to bad decisions, but to a whole lot of other policy problems, to the faking of data, and then the need to justify it, to the loss of innovation and the motivation, to the language that's no longer what can you accomplish and what can you become and what's the highest goal, the best goal. Innovation is no longer the goal. Jobs, having a job, has become the highest goal articulated by politicians. And they will do and say whatever they have to convince you that they know how to give you a job. Jobs, and yet, what do we see in South Carolina? Still an unemployment rate that's at the bottom, and still among the lowest income levels in the nation. And this is after decades. As unleashing capitalism, if you all, this is from a ways back. My pal Pete Calgano edited this, and a number of great economists put in on this, Russ Sobel included, and they talked about this practice. But I think the good news is that the people are starting to ask more questions. And we're going to have to expose this practice. This is my last point in a true story from the floor of the South Carolina Senate. So they're about to pass an economic incentive deal for a company up in Chester, I think it was Chester County. And everybody was about to vote for this. And they were pumping it up and puffing it up. And a senator asked the question, I'm sorry, isn't that company already in Chester County? So they're already here. The response, well, yeah, but our constituents don't know that. Seriously. So they voted for this incentive deal to a company that was already in the state and had been operating for several years. And they did it so they could announce it and get the credit for it. That's true. That's real. And that is the practical application and some of the consequence of these economic studies. So hopefully, I know you'll have some questions. I'm sure that these guys can do obviously a far better job of getting down into the nitty-gritty, but as someone who's on the ground saying we don't want this anymore, I can tell you we got to push fast and we got to push back hard. So that's the challenge ahead of us on that.